These are some of the most disturbing things that happen at theme parks, and as the video goes on, things will only get worse. On August 12, 1969, 18-year-old Marilyn Scheckler and 20-year-old Glenn Eckert decided to go on a late-night date in Berks County, Pennsylvania. As they were sitting in Glenn's car on Skyline Drive at around 1 AM on August 13th, after a romantic drive, truck lights would appear behind them, and 4 men would jump out, changing the course of their lives forever in an abandoned theme park called Dreamland Park. Now, Marilyn was a recent graduate of Franklin Regional High School, where she was the school mascot. That summer in 1969, Marilyn, who was originally from the Pittsburgh area, moved in with her brother, Grant, to begin a new chapter of her life. And to become independent, she started working as a cashier at the Country Kitchen, a small restaurant located inside Boscove's department store. And that was where she met Glenn. Glenn, just like Marilyn, had only recently graduated from Conrad Weiser High School in 1967, and his future looked bright as he started working in his father's restaurant inside Boscove's. Now, one of his jobs there was to collect the money and deposit it at the end of the day. And on August 12th, he made plans to meet Marilyn after work. But before he left the restaurant, Glenn collected $489 from the cash register and went to pick up Marilyn from her brother's house in his car around 9 PM. Now, the next morning on August 13th, when the two didn't return home, both his and Marilyn's families reported them missing to the police. Now, initially, the police weren't too concerned, since the two were legal adults who believed they might have just left town on their own. But Glenn's father was not convinced, since Glenn still hadn't deposited the money from the restaurant, which was unlike his son. And what happened to Marilyn and Glenn that night would eventually lead investigators to a place already known for trouble: Dreamland Park. Now, Dreamland Park had originally opened in 1938 near Reading, Pennsylvania, built by a man named Alton Crates. In its early years, Dreamland Park was a popular family destination with a roller rink, carousel, theater, picnic areas, and a large auditorium used for concerts and sporting events. But while this wholesome fun was going on, Alton's brother, Ralph Kreitz, was also secretly running illegal gambling operations from the property. So slot machines and high-stakes poker games and other gambling activities took place behind the scenes. And for some reason, the police actually turned a blind eye to this. Now, by 1956, Dreamland Park had become a hub of gamblers and drug dealers. And around the same period, Ralph would suddenly find himself in trouble with the IRS for tax evasion. And so his properties were seized and the amusement park was closed entirely. Now, it changed ownership a couple of times after that, until it was bought by Musa Eways in 1963. His son, James Eways, allowed the pagan motorcycle gang to stay on the abandoned park grounds and use it as a clubhouse in exchange for some money. Now, despite the locals being upset with the gang's presence in the park, members kept residing on the grounds, while other gangs, including the Thunderbolts, were also known to visit the property. Now, on August 12, 1969, 4 men associated with these two gangs decided to go out to the Kutztown Fair in a nearby town. This included 24-year-old Leroy S. Stoltzfus Jr. of the Pagan Gang and Thunderbolts gang members 22-year-old Robert Juice Martinolik and 33-year-old Harlan Wolfman Bailey. They were also accompanied by the son of the park's landowners, James. Now, around 11:30 PM that night, these men decided that the fair was not living up to the hype and started driving around in a rented panel truck, searching the area for unsuspecting women to abduct with the intention of launching an intimate attack on them. Now, meanwhile, Marilyn and Glenn had just finished their quiet drive. Around 1 AM, they were sitting in Glenn's parked car on Skyline Drive when the truck appeared and the 4 men spotted the couple. Now, Leroy, Robert, and Harlan then walked down toward the couple's car, while James stayed behind in the truck. With Robert carrying a gun, they forced their way in Glenn's car and threatened the young couple. They instructed Glenn to drive the car, and he had no choice but to obey. And behind them, James followed in the truck, while the others made Glenn drive to the train station in Deesport, Pennsylvania. Here, they abandoned the car, which still contained the couple's shoes, Glenn's shirt, and the $489 from his father's restaurant. They then dragged the trembling couple into the truck, and then decided to make their way back to Dreamland Park. Now, during this drive, Marilyn was repeatedly subjected to intimate violence by all 4 men, who took turns, even stopping twice on their way to change drivers so they could all have their way with her. However, just when it looked like the whole nightmare couldn't get more horrific, things would take another turn for the worse for both the victims and the perpetrators. At around 2 AM, as they were about to reach the park, they saw police cars already waiting near the entrance, but the officers weren't actually there for Marilyn and Glenn. Earlier that night, 3 men had accidentally entered the Dreamland Park property asking for directions, and as they tried to leave, the gang members stopped them, and the Pagans and the Thunderbolts assumed that they were members of a rival gang and just started beating them. Now, this went on for 2 hours, during which one of the 3 men was stabbed with a 5-inch blade. Now, after that, these men were finally allowed to leave, and they reported what happened to the police. Now, with the police already at the park, Glenn and Marilyn's kidnappers knew that they couldn't go inside, so they simply drove away. Now, they grew desperate and dragged the couple couple to the dense, dark woods east of Pricetown Road, about a mile from the park entrance. Now as they reached the woods, Robert ordered James to drive back near the park to figure out what was going on, and after James left, more and more police cars started driving towards the park's entrance. And now, desperate for a way out, Robert then told Harlan to walk to a nearby phone so he could call their friends from Thunderbolts and ask for help. And after Harlan also left, Robert and Leroy were now alone with Glenn and Marilyn. Now the young couple were tied to trees and then beaten repeatedly. Now Robert reportedly asked Glenn if he was willing to pay to live, and as Glenn laughed, he shot him twice, point blank in the face. Leroy, on the other hand, tried choking an already traumatized Marilyn, and when that didn't kill her, he smashed a rock on her head, the blow killing Marilyn instantly. Now these two gangsters then dug shallow graves to hide the bodies and covered them with rocks, grass and moss from the woods. Now around this time, James was running out of gas, so he headed to a nearby gas station, and on his way he saw Harlan, who'd been unable to find a working phone. And as the two men got to the gas station, they were actually arrested by police officers on suspicion that they were involved in the stabbing case earlier. Now Robert and Leroy were also arrested for the same case on the morning of August 13th. Now 6 days later, on August 19th, as Leroy, Robert, Harlan and James awaited trial for the stabbing case, Glenn's abandoned car was actually found at the Leesport station, and it confirmed that foul play was involved in their disappearance, since the cash bag, their shoes and Glenn's shirt was still in the car. Now the police spent actually another 2 months trying to find any trace of Glenn and Marilyn. They suspected the gang's involvement but were unable to prove what really happened to the missing couple. That was until October 23rd, 1969, when at about 1 in the afternoon, state troopers saw something shining in the woods near Dreamland Park's entrance. And turns out the shining object was actually Glenn's glasses reflecting off the sunlight, and this led officers to his body, where they also found his high school class ring near what was left of his left hand. And not even 24 hours later, on August 24th, just before 11 AM, a trooper named Robert A. Connard found Marilyn buried under a lot of boulders, approximately 650 feet away from Glenn's body. She was still wearing her yellow dress and pearl ring. Now in the 2 months it took to find their bodies, the rocks and debris covering their graves had eroded, exposing them to natural elements and allowing them to be actually discovered. And finally, what had been a missing case all along turned into a double murder investigation. Now since both the bodies were so decomposed, it was difficult to find any physical evidence that could lead the investigators to Marilyn and Glenn's murderers. However, the autopsies showed that they'd been brutally beaten, with Marilyn's head having several fractures and Glenn's skull being shattered. Now medical examiners also found the 2 holes in Glenn's head, confirming that he was shot after he was beaten. Now as police started looking at what really happened on August 12th and 13th, James and Harlan both actually offered to be witnesses to the district attorney, giving testimonies about the events of the night. Now both men said that they left the scene of the crime while Glenn and Marilyn were still alive. Harlan also said in his testimony that during their arrest for the stabbing case, he met with Leroy in the Berks County prison yard, and when he asked about Glenn and Marilyn, Leroy responded by saying, "Never mind, everything's taken care of." So after Harlan and James' testimonies, Leroy and Robert were formally charged with the murders on August 29th, 1969. And because they actually cooperated with the police, or snitched, James and Harlan were only charged for abduction and intimate violence. Now even though the court lacked physical evidence and only had the testimonies to back the case, Robert was convicted of first-degree murder on June 13th, 1970, and sentenced to life in prison. A few months later, Leroy was also given life in jail for the same conviction on August 13th, 1970. Now on the other hand, James never actually spent any jail time for his part in the murders, and Harlan only spent 2 years in county jail and was released after that. Now Leroy and Robert maintained their innocence and never confessed to the murders. According to their versions of the events, they'd been hiding under a crawl space as the police raided the park that night, and they were simply arrested afterwards. They claimed that they only saw the couple after they were brought to the woods by James and Harlan. Now Robert and Leroy both appealed their sentences in 1974 and 1975, but the appeals were rejected. The 2 men still insisted on their innocence up to the day they died in prison. Leroy on March 28, 2010 and Robert in 2018. Glenn and Marilyn faced horrors without any help nearby. The next victim, however, was surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, and yet no one could save them.
It's like a stampede full of people running towards us like, gun, run, there's a gun!
On the evening of June 23, 2021, a young man known as Dytrell Teal went to Six Flags Hurricane Harbor Water Park in Arlington, Texas with his friends for a relaxing day out. Known as Day Day to his loved ones, Dytrell had just finished his sophomore year and was preparing to start junior year at James Martin High School. He was one of the hundreds of visitors who'd come to the park that day to enjoy the slides, wave pools, and lazy rivers. But as the park began closing at around 7 PM and people started moving toward the parking lot to head home, something terrible happened. Dytrell Daytrell was with his high school friends as he, along with other parkgoers, began walking toward the large parking lot along East Lamar Boulevard. However, around the same time, a random argument suddenly broke out between a group of 6 to 8 other people inside the park, which quickly escalated into a fistfight. Now, at the center of this confrontation was 18-year-old Cameron LaVaughn Stevens, who'd apparently started the argument. Now, shortly before the chaos started, Cameron had entered the parking lot and approached a group of teenagers who were exiting the theme park and asked them, "Hey, y'all got beef with 2100 or Famous John?" Now, when the group of friends responded that they didn't know who he was talking about, the argument turned violent as Cameron kept insisting that he knew someone from their group. Now, things took a turn for the worse when Cameron ran away from his car and brought out a gun, and in a fit of rage, he began firing. Now, as people realized what was happening, panic spread throughout the park, and parkgoers stuck behind cars and ran back toward the park entrance, and some of them threw themselves to the ground to avoid being hit. Now, one witness, Ashley Birch, who was at the park with her family, said,
"It's like a stampede full of people running towards us like, gun, run, there's a gun." I was like, what's going on? What's going on? And my husband was like, don't forget to ask what's going on. We need to get out of here.
Terrified, Ashley and her family hid inside a storage area while the chaos unfolded outside. Daytrell, however, wasn't that lucky. As he ran to escape, a bullet struck the back of his neck and he collapsed near the park entrance. And at the same time, an off-duty Arlington police officer named Borowitz heard the gunshot and rushed to Daytrell. Now, during all this chaos, Cameron actually sped away in his car, while Daytrell was soon taken to Arlington Memorial Hospital. But soon after arriving, he was pronounced dead. Police soon arrived at the theme park and began interviewing witnesses while detaining several individuals who'd been involved in the fight, but they had actually no clue where the shooter was. Now, almost 2 days passed before the case finally caught a break. One of Daytrell's relatives got a tip identifying Cameron based on the description from the witnesses, and so in the early hours of June 25th, 2021, Cameron was arrested by the US Marshal Service at a convenience store in North Dallas. He was booked into the Tarrant County Jail and charged with murder. Now, after Daytrell's tragic death, his school released a public statement saying, "With a heavy heart, the Arlington ISD reports that one of our students was shot and killed last night outside of Hurricane Harbor in Arlington Water Park." But Daytrell's family believed his death could have been avoided because what happened to him was not an isolated incident. As of early 2021, even before Daytrell's incident, the entire Six Flags Arlington complex had become a hub of criminal and violent activity. In fact, on March 19, 2021, just 2 months before Daytrell's murder, 2 people got into a fight in the Six Flags over a parking lot next door. Now, during the altercation, 1 person was shot in the arm and the shooter was arrested on aggravated assault charges. Now, following his death, Daytrell's family filed for a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Six Flags Hurricane Harbor, accusing them of negligence while seeking $50 million in damages. But despite the previous incidents and the park's failure to implement proper security measures, the jury ruled in favor of Six Flags Hurricane Harbor on November 6, 2024. However, the family is now appealing the verdict, claiming that the jury was not fully informed of the crime history at Hurricane Harbor before the June 2021 shooting. Now, some relief did come for Daytrell's loved ones, after Cameron was sentenced to 40 years in prison on May 23, 2025. This next case takes us to another Six Flags parking lot, but this time the shooting was targeted, with a group putting dozens of visitors in danger yet again.
I was just really scared. So I called my husband, I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen. He said, I'm praying, I love you.
It was a typical summer Sunday on August 14, 2022, at Six Flags Great America Theme Park in Gurnee, Illinois. As one of the largest theme parks in the area, it attracts visitors from Illinois, Wisconsin, and beyond. And that day was no different. Hundreds of families filled the park, expecting nothing more than a fun day out. But within a few hours, many of them would witness something terrifying. As the sun began to set, many parkgoers started heading toward the front entrance parking lot to make their way home. But then at around 7:50 p.m., a white sedan entered the parking lot. Several individuals quickly stepped out of the vehicle and immediately began firing multiple rounds at a particular person near the park entrance. Now, with the sounds of gunfire echoing throughout the facility, people began screaming and jumping out of their way, trying to get out of harm's way. Now, within seconds, 3 people were hit, and before anyone could stop the shooters, their vehicle sped away from the scene. Now, the 3 people injured in the shooting included a 19-year-old woman from Appleton, Wisconsin, who was shot in the lower leg, an unnamed 16-year-old boy from Aurora who was shot in the upper thigh, and a third individual who suffered a shoulder injury during the chaos. Now, the first 2 victims were transported to Advocate Condell Medical Center for treatment, while the third actually declined medical attention. Fortunately, authorities later confirmed that none of the injuries were life-threatening, but the terrifying event was far from over. As police and emergency personnel secured the massive parking lot, news of the shooting quickly spread inside the park, and confused parkgoers began hearing rumors that there had been gunfire nearby, and fear spread rapidly as people thought the shooters were still around. Now what made things worse was that the shooting in the parking lot happened just a month after the tragic Highland Park attack, which took place only about 20 miles away. A man had opened fire during a 4th of July parade, killing 7 people and injuring more than 50 others. So with the last shooting still fresh in people's minds, visitors in the theme park began hiding as well. And one of these park goers was Ashley Blank, who was at the park with her 2 sons. Now her sons were on a ride at 7:49 p.m. and shots rang around the parking lot just a minute later. And hearing the gunshots, she unbuckled her sons and hopped the fence as they ran for their lives. Now they were barricaded inside a kitchen by staff with other park goers for more than an hour.
In that moment, none of us knew and all of us were terrified. I was just really scared. So I called my husband. I was like, I don't know what's gonna happen. He said, I'm praying, I love you.
Another witness named Nicole Ellsworth told a local news outlet that people started panicking and running everywhere with no real news of what happened outside. People were looking for their kids and crying. Officers ran in with guns drawn. Now nearly 3 hours after the shooting, at around 11 p.m, law enforcement officers had confirmed that there were no additional threats. So a police truck began driving around the park to announce that it was safe to come out. And slowly, parkgoers began leaving their hiding places and making their way home. And at the same time, Sean Gaylor, the public information officer with the Gurney police, spoke to the media, saying, "The shooting this evening was not a random act and appeared to be a targeted incident that occurred outside the park. This was not an active attacker incident inside the park." Now the incident once again raised concerns about security at Six Flags properties. And in response to this, Rachel Canciora, a spokesperson for the theme park, confirmed that guests are now screened before they enter the premises. However, critics were quick to point out that the shooting happened in the parking lot before any screening would have taken place. Now in the days that followed, authorities continued investigating the targeted attack, but even today, no arrests have been announced and no suspects have been publicly identified in connection with the incident. Now this case had victims without any justice, and this next case is another fight for justice for riders on a famous roller coaster who were seriously injured, all because of a simple miscommunication.
Do you know, I was gonna get my phone, I thought that ain't gonna happen. Fucking hell.
On June 2nd, 2015, 18-year-old Joe Pugh and his girlfriend Leah Washington, who was a year younger, were on their first official date at Alton Towers theme park in the UK. Now among the crowd was another couple, Vicky Belch, a 19-year-old student studying spa management, and Daniel Thorpe, a 27-year-old hotel assistant manager. And like so many others that day, they decided to try one of the park's most famous attractions, an infinity roller coaster called the Smiler. Now the roller coaster had 5 carriages called the Traits, with each having the capacity to carry 16 passengers. And as Joe, Leah, Vicky, and Daniel sat in the front row of one of the fully occupied trains, they had no idea that their giddy excitement would soon turn into horror. But before we discuss what happened to the young people riding the Smiler that day, let's first understand how it became one of the most famous rides. Now a few years earlier, in 2012, Alton Towers had announced a brand new roller coaster to replace an older indoor ride. The new ride was initially known as Secret Weapon 7, with the name being a known marketing tactic by Alton Towers to build curiosity. And as the ride was being constructed, it was revealed that this new roller coaster would feature a record-breaking 14 inversions, where riders will be flipped upside down. And not only that, it would also have effects like spinning discs, mist, and flashing screens. It was marketed as a psychological experience, which would leave the riders smiling. So it all made sense when in January 2013, the ride's name was finally announced as the Smiler. And the excitement around the Smiler was already huge. Competitions were held so people could be the first ones to ride it, and TV personalities were invited for the experience. But the launch didn't exactly go smoothly. Just before opening in March of 2013, the ride stalled on a lift hill during a press preview, and people had to be evacuated. Now this delayed the opening to May of 2013, but these technical issues weren't fully resolved even then. The trains on the ride would sometimes stall on the Batwing section, and one time around 50 riders had to be evacuated after a bolt came loose and created a small gap in the track. In the same year, some guide wheels fell from a train, injuring 4 riders. And while the park reassured that they were not taking these issues lightly, these problems were kind of seen as normal early issues in such complex rides. And so although 2013 was not a great year for the Smiler due to the early performance hiccups, by 2014 things had improved, with the ride running smoothly, and it quickly became a popular attraction at the park. So on June 2nd, 2015, things were going normally as well. The weather was particularly windy that day, with strong gusts reaching up to 46 miles per hour. Now some rides in the park were closed because of this, but the Smiler continued to operate, even though the manufacturer's limit for it was 34 miles per hour. Now usually the roller coaster operated with 4 trains. On very busy days though, a fifth train would sometimes be added so visitors didn't have to wait too long in the line. And that day the queues were especially long, and the operating staff, which was often called the ride crew, decided to add a fifth train to the Smiler. However, at around 1:08 PM, the ride's safety system detected a fault, and so by 1:10 PM, a train waiting in the station couldn't actually move, and the passengers were asked to get off. Now, while the engineers worked to fix the issue, a fifth train was added to the station, but the ride crew did not inform the engineers, and so shortly after, an empty train, train 3, was sent out to test the track. Now, this train made its way through the ride, but then stopped on a section called the Bad Way. This part of the ride had several loops, and the empty train lost speed because of the strong wind. Now it rolled back and forth and stopped at a point in the section called the Apex. Now back at the station at 1:41 PM, the waiting passengers were allowed to board the next train, train 4. Joe, Leah, Vicky and Daniel were seated toward the front, with 12 other passengers filling the rest of the train. And so as train 4 was now sent up the lift hill, the ride's safety system correctly detected that train 3 was still on the track. So it stopped train 4 at the top of the hill and displayed an error message indicating that the track ahead was still occupied. Now at this point the system was still working exactly as it should. However, the engineers thought that the warning was a system error caused by the earlier issue, and they assumed that all trains were accounted for, since they could see 3 at the station and knew that train 4 was occupied. They had no idea that train 3 was still on the track ahead, as they didn't know the 5th train was even added in. So at around 1:51 PM, train 4 was released, with train 3 still stuck ahead. It began moving down the track, picking up speed as normal, and just seconds later, it entered the Batwing section and crashed into train 3 at a speed of about 90 miles per hour, causing the front of the carriage to cave in on the passengers' legs. Now the front row where Joe, Leah, Vicky and Daniel were seated took the full force of the collision, and the trains became tangled and rocked back and forth, leaving passengers injured and terrified. Now 2 engineers in the control room heard the crash and went to investigate, seeing the horrific scene in front of them. Now park management was informed at 1:57 PM, but the 999 emergency call wasn't made until 2:08, 11 minutes later. Now when firefighters, paramedics and maintenance staff arrived, they found the train suspended approximately 23 feet above a concrete pit, and this made the rescue much more difficult, so they used ladders and scaffolding to reach the passengers. Now the rescue took over 4 hours. Firefighters used heavy cutting tools to free the people from the twisted steel restraints and folded metal. 11 of the 16 passengers required hospital treatment, but for the front row passengers, the injuries would prove to be life-changing. Leah's legs were badly crushed, and Vicky also suffered serious leg injuries. Joe had shattered kneecaps and extensive hand injuries, while Daniel suffered from a collapsed lung and a fractured leg. Another passenger, 49-year-old Chandabin Chauhan, who was in the second row, had internal injuries and even had to get stomach surgery. Now Leah and Vicky's injuries were so severe that they required amputations. Vicky later described the pain she felt during the collision, saying,
"The only thing that was going through my mind for the hours and hours that we were stuck was that we were going to die. If I was going to survive, I would never walk again. That was certain. I thought it was never going to end. I just wanted to die."
The accident was so severe that the medical staff who treated Leah later said that they were surprised that she didn't die from her injuries on the ride. One of the doctors, Dr. Ben Clark, said,
"There were a lot of times when I was just shaking my head because I didn't know if it was going to work and if they were going to stay alive.
I just can't thank them enough for what they've done for me. They saved my life, so they're amazing."
Now after the incident, the Smiler was immediately shut down while an investigation began, and as officials looked into what happened, it became clear that it wasn't caused by a system failure, but by a series of human and judgment errors. Now after the incident, Merlin Entertainments, which owned Alton Towers, shut down 3 similar roller coasters at other parks, while they reviewed their safety procedures. Now these rides were later reopened, but the Health and Safety Executive, or HSE, placed a strict ban on reopening the Smiler until it was fully satisfied that changes had been made to prevent anything like the accident from happening again. Now the HSE later took legal action against Merlin. The theme park had originally said the accident was caused by human error, but prosecutors argued that the fault lay with the company, not individuals, and so Merlin pleaded guilty and on September 27, 2016 were fined with $6.9 million or £5 million. Now at the time it was the highest fine ever given to a theme park or fairground operator in the UK. Now although there were calls to close the Smiler permanently after the accident, it already reopened in March of 2016 and it continues to operate at Alton Towers with improved safety features, new procedures and hopefully stricter protocols regarding wind speeds. Now while the Smiler crash changed the lives of many of its riders, this next amusement park case is a much darker one of a shooting practice gone wrong.
Let's talk about some stuff that's happened at Carowinds, which sits on the border of North Carolina and South Carolina.
Located on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina, Carowinds amusement park drew large crowds of families from nearby Charlotte and beyond, especially in the summertime, and that was exactly the case on a bright summer day on June 7, 1987. One of the park's main summer attractions at the time was the Ocean Island Water Park, which featured an artificial beach and large wave pool. Now on that Sunday, hundreds of visitors were relaxing and cooling off around the pool. Among them was a 13-year-old named Michelle Ann Sexton from Rock Hill, South Carolina. Earlier that day, she'd packed a cooler of soft drinks and joined her boyfriend to have some fun at the park. However, while many parkgoers like Michelle were enjoying their day, they didn't know the situation inside the park had already taken a dangerous turn. That same day, 2 separate stabbings had already taken place in the park, raising security concerns. Still, it remained crowded, with thousands of people going about their day, just like Michelle, who had no idea she would soon find herself at the center of a horrifying scene. At around 3:45 p.m., Michelle was in the wave pool area along with nearly 2,000 other parkgoers, and as she relaxed on a raft in the water, a bullet suddenly struck her in the back. Now panic broke out almost immediately as people saw Michelle bleeding in the pool, but she wasn't the only victim of this mysterious attack. About 50 to 70 feet away, a minor named Ahesha Chanel Rollins was hit by another bullet in the abdomen. Now the lively pool area that Sunday suddenly erupted into chaos. People screamed and ran for safety, while lifeguards rushed into actions, pulling the girls out of the water and calling for immediate medical help. Now considering the fact that security was already on high alert due to the earlier stabbings in the park, the possibility of an active shooter only made things worse. The only problem was, no one knew where those bullets actually came from, and as the search started for the culprits who shot Michelle and Ahesha, paramedics transported both girls to Charlotte Memorial Hospital for urgent treatment. Now Ahesha underwent surgery for her serious abdominal injury and was later reported to be in stable condition. Michelle, however, didn't actually survive. Now Mecklenburg County Police Assistant Chief R.D. Farrell immediately launched an investigation, and helicopters and tracking dogs were used to search the 70-acre resort to make sure that there was no ongoing threat inside the park. However, the rough woods surrounding the park made it hard for the police to find the shooter, and with no culprit or motive established, investigators soon concluded that the shots had actually come from outside the park. Now this shifted the search to the nearby wooded areas, and for 7 days there weren't actually any leads. However, the case took a major turn a week later when 31-year-old James Bogatay turned himself into the police and handed over the weapon he used in the shooting that killed Michelle. It turned out that at the same time as Michelle was enjoying water activities in the park, 5 men from the Charlotte area decided to go for a targeted shooting practice. These men included James and his 4 companions: 30-year-old Gerald Turner, 20-year-old Charles Kupfer, 19-year-old Richard Cadell, and 21-year-old Richard Grotzinger. On the morning of June 7, the men drove to a wooded clearing around half a mile west of the Carowinds wave pool to do some target practice, even though there was no authorized shooting range in the area. Target practice there was illegal, because the powerful 7.62mm rounds they used could easily travel long distances, since there were no backstops or proper blockages in the area, like you would find in a traditional shooting practice range, creating a serious risk for stray bullets. And so that afternoon, the 5 men set up targets in the wooded area. The rounds they were firing were capable of traveling over half a mile, making them an immediate danger to people inside the park. But with no concern for safety, James, Gerald, Charles, and Richard, and the other Richard, began taking turns firing the high-powered rifle. And while some bullets hit the targets, others flew past them, and stray rounds began traveling toward the innocent parkgoers inside Carowinds, particularly people in the Ocean Island section. And as they kept shooting, stray bullets hit Ahesha and claimed Michelle's life. Now initial reports had suggested that the girls were hit by bullets fired from a semi-automatic weapon, but once police examined the gun James had brought in, they discovered something far more serious. What looked like a legal semi-automatic firearm turned out to be a Chinese-made clone of a Soviet AK-47 that was illegally modified to function as a machine gun, which is a federal felony. And so as a result, on June 19, 1987, all of them were arrested on federal charges of possessing an unregistered machine gun in connection with the shooting. Now because the 5 men had been taking turns firing the weapon, investigators couldn't actually determine who fired the specific bullet that caused Michelle's passing, which was ultimately ruled as an accidental death. So instead of facing murder and attempted murder charges, the shooters were only charged for owning an illegal weapon. So months later, in September 1987, the men were sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, their sentences were all suspended, allowing them a reduced prison time, as long as they avoided committing another crime. Now this led James to serve 4 months in prison, followed by 2 years of probation. Similarly, Gerald only served 6 months in prison and 2 years of probation. Now the 3 younger men, Charles, Richard M, and Richard P, were ordered to complete community service and probation instead of serving any prison time at all. Now after this horrific incident, Carowinds park officials were forced to rethink park security, and even added metal detectors at the entrance because of the multiple violent acts in and around the resort court on June 7, 1987. Now a few years later, in 1991, while trying to find some sort of justice for their daughter, Michelle's parents actually filed a $10,000 civil wrongful death lawsuit against Crescent Land and Timber Corporation, the owner of the property where the men had been target practicing. They claimed the owners were negligent as dangerous activities took place in that area. However, the jury found that the landowners weren't actually responsible because there was no evidence that they knew that people were target practicing there or had a way to stop it. Now, while this next case isn't about a shooting, it involves a popular amusement park ride that went wrong just in seconds, putting dozens of lives at risk and forcing the government to shut the entire park down. It was the peak of summer season at Green Mountain Park in the Al Hada area of Taif, Saudi Arabia, on July 31st, 2025. Now, Green Mountain is a scenic mountain resort amusement park, with one of the most famous rides being the 360 Big Pendulum ride. Now, the Big Pendulum ride, which was manufactured by Italian company Rides and Fun, was installed in the park in 2023. The ride featured a circular swing or a gondola that strapped passengers into their seats. The gondola was attached to a large central pole that swung passengers in giant circular arcs. Since then, the 360 Big Pendulum ride had operated regularly without any reported mechanical issues or safety complaints for nearly 2 full years. It quickly became one of the park's signature thrill rides for visitors who wanted an instant adrenaline rush. Now, according to reports, routine maintenance and checks were done on the ride and they were all consistent with the standard industry practices. Now, on July 31st, 2025, the ride had been busy all day long. It went through multiple successful cycles that day with no visible issues noted by any operator or guest. Sometime that evening though, a new group of passengers was strapped into their seats on their circular gondola, ready for the ride to start. Now, the operator performed standard pre-ride checks and pushed the start button, allowing the central pole to begin its back and forth pendulum motion while the gondola rotated. Now, riders screamed in excitement as the gondola moved and began building speed, but then suddenly there was a loud snapping sound. And the riders' excitement turned into horror as the central poles supporting the circular swing snapped in half, sending the entire swing crashing onto the ground. The footage of the moment showed riders' shoes flying off from the force of the impact, and debris and parts of the ride flew through the air as the swing came down hard, with riders still restrained in their seats. Now, the impact created a cloud of dust, with metal fragments flying across the area, and the debris from the broken pole flew outward, hitting nearby bystanders as well as the riders on the swing. Now, emergency calls went out instantly as park staff and witnesses rushed to help those strapped in the wreckage. First responders from the Red Crescent and Civil Defense arrived within minutes and secured the site so they could safely rescue trapped riders and provide immediate medical aid. Now, at least 23 people were injured as a result. Some suffered bruises and fractures, while 3 to 4 riders were critically injured and required urgent medical care. Now, the investigators later noted that the gondola briefly corrected itself before hitting the ground, a factor that likely prevented even more serious injuries. Now, once the authorities were notified of the horrific accident the same evening, they immediately ordered the closure of Green Mountain Park and began a full investigation into the cause of the structural failure. Fortunately, no one lost their life in the accident, especially given the height from which the gondola fell and the speed at which the pole failed. Now, after the incident, the entire amusement park, including all other rides, remained closed, while safety inspections and official investigation continued. Authorities examined the broken ride parts, maintenance logs, and operational records to find out what caused the central pole to actually snap. Now, as of this recording, the investigation is still ongoing, with no answers given to the victims yet. But as the victims have to wait for the answers, this next case isn't about a single ride going wrong. Instead, it is a local urban legend whose tragic story stretches back centuries.
People said whenever they come to the park that they see the swings move on their own, or maybe they see an image of the little girl that's riding the swings.
The year was 1966. For decades, Lake Shawnee Amusement Park had been a popular local attraction. It was located in Mercer County, near Princeton and the small community of Rock, West Virginia. Since opening in 1926, it has served as a recreational escape for families from nearby coal towns. But that year, the park became the site of a tragedy that will leave a permanent mark on its history. On that fateful summer day in 1966, a young girl who we'll call Anna arrived at the park, wearing a pink ruffled dress. Now, while the actual date of her visit is unclear, what we do know is that she made her way to one of the park's most popular attractions, a circular swing ride. The ride lifted its suspended seats outward as it spun, moving riders in circles above the ground. Now, Anna took a seat and the operator started the ride, and as the swings picked up speed, the chairs rose outward from the central pole, moving round and round. Now, nearby, a delivery truck had arrived to supply soda to one of the park's concession stands. As the ride continued swinging, the truck moved through the area and struck the exact swing Anna was playing on, and unfortunately, the impact was fatal. instantly causing Anna's death. It was a devastating accident and one of the most remembered tragedies connected to Lake Shawnee amusement park. But the park's history is actually far bloodier than just one isolated incident. In 1775, long before the park opened, an English settler named Mitchell Clay moved to that same area with his wife Phoebe and their 14 kids after receiving a land grant, which meant the government had given him land to live on and farm. Now they settled in a valley known as Clover Bottom in what is now Mercer County, West Virginia. Now the Clay family cleared fields, built cabins, and began farming. Now at the time there were only a few European settlers in the area. The land was also traditionally used by the indigenous Shawnee tribe, who'd occupied and traveled through the region for generations. And by 1783, tensions between the settlers and the Native American tribes had increased, as more settlers moved west into traditional tribal territory. In August 1783, a group of Shawnee warriors approached the Clay family homestead, while Mitchell was away from the property. At the time, many of the younger family members from the Clay family were working, and then out of nowhere, the Shawnee warriors attacked the Clay family. According to historical records, the tribesmen first killed Bartley Clay, Mitchell's older son, and when his daughter Tabitha tried to defend her brothers, she was also killed. Another one of Mitchell's sons, Ezekiel, was captured alive and taken by the Shawnee warriors to their village in Chillicothe, Ohio, where he was later killed as well. And when Mitchell returned home, he found the bodies of his son and daughter, and overcome with grief and enraged after hearing about Ezekiel's capture, he quickly gathered a group of settlers from the area and set out to track down the Shawnee raiders. Now according to some sources, when Mitchell found the Shawnee raiding party, he and his group of settlers killed the tribesmen in retaliation for what had happened to his family, and this bloodshed later became known as the Clover Bottom Massacre. However, other accounts claim that Mitchell eventually found Ezekiel dead and made a pact with the tribe leaders in return for a dignified burial for his son. Either way, the conflict at the time eventually ended, and both sons and daughter were buried on Mitchell's homestead. But the bloody history of what happened there would continue to follow the people settling in that area. After the bloodshed in 1783, the Clay family sold portions of their land, and for more than a century, the area remained underdeveloped, as stories about the violent tragedies that happened there quietly passed down Mercer County residents and descendants. Now by the 1920s, the area was filled with coal mining communities, and this gave businessman Colony Triggs Nido the idea to build an amusement park there. He believed that local families would flock to the park in their free time, so he purchased the historic land parcel with plans to build a park with rides, a pool, and other attractions. And so Lake Shawnee Amusement Park opened its gates in 1926, and it quickly became popular among residents of the nearby coal towns, especially during the summer months. The park featured a spring-fed swimming pool, a Ferris wheel, a circular swing ride, a dance hall, concession stands, and cabins. Now during the 1930s and 1940s, Lake Shawnee Park experienced its most successful era, but soon the land's tragic past would seem to catch up with it. Sources say that in the 1950s, several deaths had occurred on the park's property. In one incident, a young person who'd been dropped off by his mother at the park's swimming pool was later found lifeless in the water after his arm reportedly became stuck in a drainage pipe. In another case, a mother died after a canoe overturned in the lake on the park grounds. Although the park continued to attract visitors, concerns began to grow among locals about the number of accidents on the property. And when Anna was crushed to death on the circular swing ride in 1966, it proved to be the final straw. Under immense public scrutiny, Colony and the park's management eventually decided to stop operation. This decision was made after at least 6 people had died on the park grounds. In 1967, Lake Shawnee Amusement Park was then officially closed. The original rides, including the Ferris wheel and the circular swing, were sold off, and the land stayed abandoned for nearly 2 decades. Then in 1986, a man named Gaylord White, who'd worked at the park in his youth, purchased the long abandoned property. Now Gaylord's wife, Jewel White, explained,
Gaylord, my husband, worked here when he was in high school. He fell in love with it. So that was his wish, that someday he would own the park. And somebody had sent us word that the heirs had finally decided they were going to sell it. That's how we bought it.
Gaylord and his family had plans to reopen the park, and to do so, they needed 2 of its most recognizable attractions, a Ferris wheel and a circular swing ride. They installed a Ferris wheel, but when it came to the circular swing, the story got interesting. Chris, Gaylord's son, said in an interview in 2015,
"We found a swing in New Jersey, loaded it up, and brought it back. When we got there, we ran the serial numbers and found it was the exact same swing that used to be here."
After all these years, what was now called the cursed swing by some people had made its way back home. Unfortunately, the park would only operate for 3 seasons. Since 1988, the insurance cost became too much for the family to bear, so they decided to close the amusement park and shift to other activities on the property to keep the money coming in. Now, one of the activities they agreed on was an off-road motorsport called mud bogging. The White family thought this would bring in large crowds, but while digging the ground in preparation in 1988, they found something that would add another layer to the park's land's already devastating history. According to Chris,
we were bulldozing and we started finding artifacts. We found arrowheads, pottery, and pots. So we stopped. We said, this is pretty interesting. Let's get somebody out there and see what we can do.
So the White family actually called in a team from Marshall University, which spent the next few years digging up the land to search for more artifacts and graves. It turned out that the area where Lake Shawnee Amusement Park stood had been once used as a burial ground for the indigenous Shawnee tribe, dating back to the 17th. The Marshall University team concluded that as many as 3,000 Shawnee people may have been buried on the property. Many of the graves belonged to the elderly and young people, with Chris explaining the university findings as,
the only thing they can figure out is that some kind of flu or illness spread through the tribe. To protect the rest of their people, everyone except kids and the elderly left.
Now, since the early 1990s, park tours allowed visitors to see the areas where members of the Clay family were buried, as well as see burial sites connected to the Shawnee people. Now, paranormal investigators also visit regularly, believing the land may be haunted. Now, while Lake Shawnee's park's tragic history attracted crowds, the next park became popular for rides that were so dangerous, it's almost unbelievable that it remained open for nearly 2 decades.
There's nothing in the world like Action Park.
The story of Action Park, known to be one of the most dangerous amusement parks in the country, started with a man named Jeannie Mulvihill. Jeannie was a businessman who purchased the Vernon Valley Great Gorge ski area in northern New Jersey in the 1970s. However, the ski resort only made money during the winter months, and Jeannie wanted to build something that could bring visitors all year round. And so that idea eventually gave birth to Action Park. Jeannie wanted the park to be unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. According to his son Andy,
Jeannie didn't want to do the same old thing, where you just get strapped into something or it twirls around. He wanted to take the idea of skiing, which is exhilarating because you control the action, and transfer it to an amusement park. There's inherent risks in that, but that's what makes it fun.
So as a trial run for that wild, untamed fun, Jeannie opened the now infamous Alpine Slide in 1976 to attract visitors during the summer months. The 2,700-foot slide had riders sitting in small sleds with a stick to control the brakes and speed. The track was made of concrete and fiberglass, so if someone lost control or fell off the sled, they could end up with painful skin burns due to the friction from uneven surfaces and other injuries. And yet the experiment was a success, as people kept on coming to the park to enjoy the dangerous ride, and it set the tone for the virtually no safety measures and user-controlled thrills that Action Park would eventually offer. Now 2 years later, Action Park officially opened its gates in 1978 with the tagline,
"The action never stops at Action Park."
The idea was that visitors would be in control of the thrills. The park was essentially divided into 3 parts: the Alpine Center, Water World, and Motor World. These sections were home to some of the park's most famous and deadly rides, like the Alpine Slide and the Wave Pool. Unfortunately, that non-stop action was not always the good kind, because when mixed with amateur ride design and poor safety protocols, young and untrained staff, it created the perfect environment for the many tragedies that would happen there in the years to come. The main problem was that Jeannie had a habit of cutting corners wherever he could, and many of these wild rides were designed either by park employees, non-professional designers, or by Jeannie himself. Moreover, the staff was pretty young, and alcohol was also easily available, with many employees drinking on the job. Now, but despite this, Action Park still managed to attract almost 1 million visitors every year. Marketing the rides as user-controlled adventures made it easier for Jeannie to keep operating this dangerous park. Then head lifeguard Bob Krahulik told People magazine in 2025 that
many of the rides were experimental, and on paper the design looked good, but in reality, once the ride was turned on, it was not fit for a safe ride by the average person in public.
Now, safety rules around amusement parks were still pretty new in the 1980s, and inspectors didn't always know what to look for, so most rides kept passing. And Jeannie was also an expert at exploiting loopholes. He hired young staff who often called him Uncle Jeannie and used them to test his new rides in exchange for money. He even called his park rides sporting attractions, meaning he described them as activities where people were actively and voluntarily taking part in. This allowed him to run the business without stricter permits for amusement parks, while shifting liability to the riders. And in the beginning, the state of New Jersey didn't actually intervene as long as the rides were insured. However, there was just one more problem. Jeannie also didn't believe in insurance. He thought it was too expensive. Premiums would take almost $2 million a year, and no one was willing to cover his dangerous rides. So he actually created a fake insurance company called London and World Assurance Ltd. on October 12, 1977 in the Cayman Islands, a year before the park officially opened. This way he could produce fake insurance documents and keep the premiums for himself. Soon after Action Park opened, reports of injuries from poorly designed rides became common. Chipped teeth, broken bones, head trauma, and scrapes became the norm. In fact, so many people were injured that Genie actually had to buy nearby hospitals more ambulances in the 1980s because emergency room doctors were overwhelmed with the number of people who ended up there after visiting Action Park. Now, one of the wildest attractions at the park was the battle action tanks. These were basically bumper cars, but with one actual working cannon fitted onto them that shot tennis balls at speeds of around 100 miles per hour. Now, drivers controlled the tanks with a joystick and fired at other riders. However, when employees entered the arena to collect stray balls, crowds would cheer as they were hit by the riders too. Now, among the crowd was sometimes Genie himself. In fact, some even claimed that he would often put late employees on ball collecting duty as punishment. Now, another infamous ride was the Super Go-Karts. They were designed to go about 20 miles per hour, but staff would sometimes tweak the controls to make them go as fast as 50 miles per hour, and even take them out on the local highway after the park closed. Now, reports of broken bones, whiplash, and cars crashing into nearby trees were also common, and yet the ride kept operating. But one of the most unbelievable attractions was the Speedboat Lagoon, where riders hopped into small speedboats and drove them through a man-made lagoon. The problem was that these waters were reportedly infested with snakes, and boats would sometimes flip over, throwing riders into the water with snakes slithering nearby. It's said that on an average busy day, the park would see anywhere from 50 to 100 injuries. But Genie had his own method of making sure that no one would find out about how many people were getting hurt daily. Filmmaker Seth Porges, who made a documentary about the park in 2020, explained that
They had an on-site infirmary. Unless you had a broken bone, you wouldn't go to the hospital, and your injuries wouldn't be reported.
Now, only a year after the park opened, the Alpine slide would become known for frequent injuries in 1979 and early 1980, and the only thing management did about this was post bloody pictures of injuries at the top of the ride to discourage reckless visitors. And when inspectors instructed the park to remove rocks around the slide because it was a major safety hazard, management still chose to simply ignore it. Now, the brakes on the sets used on the slide barely worked. Sometimes riders would simply fly down the slide with no way to slow down, and other times the brakes would get stuck, causing collisions with other riders. And despite these warnings, management simply ignored everything and continued, and soon things would take a much darker turn. On July 8, 1980, 19-year-old George Larson Jr. decided to ride the Alpine slide after hours with some of his friends, but somewhere along the line, his sled's brake failed and he went off the track, hitting the very same rocks inspectors had told the park to remove. Now, he fell into a coma and died on July 16, only days after he was supposed to be the best man at his brother's wedding, and this was the park's first reported death. Now, officials tried to cover it up by saying that he was a former employee who was just on the ride and got into an accident. But when these claims were proven false, Genie eventually settled with the Larson family for $100,000. But this wasn't the last time someone would lose their life at Action Park. While the Alpine slide was where the park saw its first victim, the water world section proved to be the deadliest. In 1981, Action Park opened the tidal wave pool, one of the first freshwater wave pools in the US. In those days, the waves could reach up to 4 feet, making it hard for people to float on water. And on busy days, lifeguards had to rescue at least 20 to 30 people, and near drownings became a regular occurrence. Now, things were going as well as they could, until tragedy struck once again. On July 24, 1982, a young person named George Lopez was suddenly pulled under by the waves and began drowning, and upon noticing, several lifeguards tried to save him, but it was too late, and he unfortunately passed away. This horrible accident earned the pool its nickname, the Grave Pool. Now, a week later, a 27-year-old man named Jeffrey Nathan was enjoying the kayak experience ride when his kayak tipped, and he touched a live wire that was just strangely sitting underwater, and this immediately electrocuted him to death, as Action Park claimed another victim. And as usual, no proper safety barriers were in place at the time of the incident, and yet the park continued operation as if nothing happened. As a matter of fact, in 1983, construction began on probably the most infamous ride at Action Park, the Cannonball Loop, a 100-foot enclosed water slide with a vertical loop that shot people into the landing pool. According to reports, Genie designed it himself on a napkin. Now, employees were paid $100 to test the ride, and it was reported that the initial dummies used to test it came out in broken pieces, sometimes even with no head. Yet Genie kept working on his plans to open the ride to the public soon. Now, while Cannonball was being built though, the park would experience another major tragedy. In early 1984, an unnamed parkgoer on the Tarzan swing swung into freezing spring water underneath, and as he hit the ice-cold water, he suffered a fatal heart attack, which marked the 4th documented death at the park. Then, on August 27, 1984, the tidal wave pool claimed another victim, after a 20-year-old man named Donald D. Pass tragically passed away by drowning. And as the deaths piled up, Genie also became entangled in serious legal trouble. In 1984, he was indicted on 110 counts of insurance fraud for falsifying records that he was paying insurance insurance while keeping the premiums for himself. It was one of the biggest insurance fraud cases in New Jersey at the time, and in November of the same year, he pleaded guilty to 5 charges and received 3 years probation. However, he served no jail time, even after being indicted for 110 counts, and despite everything, he still remained in control of Action Park. Now, even after Jeannie's legal troubles and the deaths that occurred in 1984, the 100-foot cannonball loop was still open to the public in summer of 1985, adding another dangerous ride to the roster, and as expected, it was brutal. Riders came out bruised, bloody, and some even lost teeth. It got so bad at some point that emergency hatches were installed to help riders who got stuck come out of the ride. Now, Jim Desai, the park security director, described the horrors, saying,
"The first couple of people that came in, came out and their mouths were all bloody. And that was before they had put sufficient padding in the top. There was a little bit, so they sent a couple of other people down, and when those people came down, they came down with lacerations. They couldn't figure out why these people had lacerations from a giant loop. Then they took the loop apart and found teeth stuck in the padding from the first couple of people that went down the slide, and got their teeth knocked out, and these other people are going up and ripping into it."
Now, regulators closed Cannonball a month later, after 110 reported injuries, including 10 fractures, and 45 head traumas were reported. Still, Jeannie tried repeatedly to get it running again. But soon after that, Action Park would experience a horrific incident so bad that it almost shut down the entire company. On July 19, 1987, 18-year-old Gregory Grandchamps drowned in the tidal wave pool, the same wave pool that caused numerous drownings before, and this brought the confirmed death count to 6. From then on, through the late 80s and early 90s, lawsuits would actually keep piling up, as victims and their families tried to bring the park's management to justice. And since Action Park was running without liability insurance, the park had to directly pay for the damages caused to their visitors. So with constant payments to victims, Jeannie finally decided to get an insurance policy by May of 1995. However, once the bank holding the park's loans found out that it had been operating without proper insurance, they also sued Action Park for $19 million. Then in March of 1996, the park's parent company, Great American Recreation, went into bankruptcy, and a few months later, on September 2nd, 1996, Action Park closed for good, after 18 years, with at least 6 people dead and thousands injured. The property that once housed the Wallace Park was mostly abandoned until 1998, when a company named Intra-West bought it, removed the dangerous rides, and reopened it as Mountain Creek Water Park, with proper safety rules this time. But in 2010, Jeannie actually attempted to bring back Action Park. He bought the park property back with his family and briefly changed its name back to Action Park from Mountain Creek Water Park in 2014. However, this time it had safer rides like the Alpine Mountain Coaster, which operated on tracks so the cars couldn't fly off. But by 2016, the park's name changed back to Mountain Creek because the Action Park brand was so deeply linked with its wild, dangerous past that it was failing to bring in new customers. Now, even though Jeannie repeatedly showed disregard for rules and the safety of his customers while he was running Action Park, his son Andy disagreed that his father tried to profit off of cheap thrills. He claimed,
"For Jeannie, Action Park was never about the money, it was about fun, creating something no one had ever seen. As for the people who died, I'm sure Dad went to every one of them to say he's sorry."
And despite Action Park constantly putting visitors at risk though, it was an incident in the next haunted castle that changed park safety laws forever.
On May 11th, 1984, the park would witness one of the most tragic theme park incidents of all time, the fire at the haunted castle.
The date was May 11, 1984. It was the perfect spring day, and Six Flags Great Adventure was in full operation. Families waited in line to get on different rides, and crowds of young visitors made their way across the park for a relaxing day out. Now scattered within the crowds were school groups from New York and New Jersey, including students from Franklin K. Lane High School and Victory Christian School, who were on a field trip. Among the chatting students were Jose Carrion Jr., Eric Rodriguez, Lenny Reese, and Samuel Valentine Jr., all seniors from Franklin K. Lane High School in Queens, New York. They were joined by Christopher Harrison, a recent graduate who'd come along for the day with his former school friends. Meanwhile, best friends Tina Marie Genovese and Suzette Elliott had come for a field trip with Victory Christian School in Williamstown, New Jersey. Also walking around the park were friends Joseph Beiruti Jr. and Nicola Kayasa from Patterson, New Jersey, who'd come together to celebrate their last Friday before starting summer drops. Now sometime after 6 p.m, these 9 people found themselves in line for the same famous Six Flags attraction, the Haunted Castle. And while on the queue, they would all start chatting and joking with each other. And then at around 6:20 p.m, they all linked arms and crossed the drawbridge to enter the attraction. But none of them had any idea what awaited them inside. Now, to understand what those 9 young people walked into and how it completely altered their lives, the story of the haunted castle has to be told from kind of the beginning. 6 years earlier, in 1978, Six Flags Great Adventure decided to do a trial run for the haunted castle, so they leased 4 aluminum semi-trailers from the Toms River Haunted House Company, joined them together and turned it into a temporary walkthrough attraction. Now, the park management did not expect how much school groups and families would love the haunted castle, and with the massive success they recorded, the management decided to make it a permanent feature at the park. Now, at the end of that season, the trailers were disassembled and sent to another Six Flags park, while the park set in motion their plans to make a larger version of the haunted castle. So when the 1979 season started, the bigger and better haunted castle was opened. This time they used 17 interconnected aluminum trailers. The design divided the attraction into 2 parts connected by a control room, and both sections were mirror images of each other. Now, from the outside, the haunted castle looked impressive, designed like a medieval castle, which was where it got its name from. Now, on the inside, visitors walked through a dark maze that was about 450 feet long. They moved through a twisting path of narrow hallways and small rooms, and the attraction was intentionally very dim, with strobe lights and eerie sounds, and sudden turns that made it hard to see where you're going. The interior was made using plywood partitions, wooden frames, painted turrets, and extensive foam padding. Now, the structure was open day and night, and quickly became a fan favorite, so much so that it became the park's largest single draw. However, even as visitors loved walking through the haunted castle, they had no idea how much danger they were putting themselves in each time. The park's management had been extremely negligent when it came to safety measures inside the structure. There were no sprinklers, no smoke detectors, and no functional exit lights. From 1979 to early 1984, safety consultants hired by the park conducted semi-annual inspections of the haunted castle, and they issued repeated written warnings, asking management to install fire suppression or alarm systems and create safer exit routes. According to them, the maze, which was lined with foam, was highly flammable and posed a major fire hazard without proper safety procedures in place. However, park management rejected these recommendations. This included Larry Cochran, who served as vice president and general manager of Six Flags Great Adventure from about 1978 to 1982, and David Polczyk, who succeeded him and was the active general manager in 1984. They both argued that installing a full sprinkler system would be too expensive and impractical. Since the haunted castle was made from connected trailers, they were technically still on wheels, making it a temporary structure. Now, the township accepted this argument and classified the attraction as a temporary structure, meaning no building permits or fire inspections were required. Instead, management said they had the situation under control and relied on employees to keep checking the haunted castle for any signs of fire. However, the other problem with the attraction was that the lights often went out, so in order to find their way through the long, winding passages, visitors sometimes lit matches or cigarette lighters to see where they were going. And so on that fateful day, when Jose, Eric, Lenny, Samuel, Christopher, Joseph, Nicola, Tina, and Suzette made their way inside the haunted castle, the management's negligence would finally make headlines. Now, only one side of the mirror castle was open that day, and around 30 people were inside. Now, as the group made their way through the maze, a park employee jumped out at the group to scare them, and afterwards the boys in the group suggested that they should hide in one of the corners and do the same thing to another set of visitors they could hear behind them. Now, at about 6:35 p.m, while the group was hiding quietly, waiting to scare people, other visitors, including an unnamed person we'll call Adam, made his way into the strobe room, and as it had happened many times before, the lights suddenly went out, and to see where he was going, Adam flicked open a lighter. But the flame accidentally touched the foam padding in the room, and within moments it caught fire. The flames spread quickly through the foam and plywood, racing through the narrow trailers. Now, fear swept through the crowd as people realized what was happening. Now, some quick-thinking employees managed to guide a lot of the visitors outside before the fire spread further. But as the fire continued to spread, the 9 young people hiding in the corners began to get really scared. The boys from the group started running in different directions, but in the darkness and confusion, they had no idea where to go. And so thick smoke rushed towards them as the air conditioning fans pushed it deeper into the structure. Now, to make the whole thing even worse, Suzette was knocked down and stepped on as people tried to push their way toward the entrance. Now, she grabbed onto whatever she could find to try and escape, but she was almost at the exit when the smoke simply became too much. Exhausted and struggling to breathe, she fell to her knees. But just then, a park employee reached her and dragged her outside to safety. But the other 8 in the group were trapped deeper inside the trailers, and soon the thick smoke left them disoriented, and one by one, they collapsed. Now, while more than 20 people made their way outside, 8 young people from the original group of 9 never made it out the haunted castle alive, with Suzette being the only survivor. Now, in the midst of the chaos, firefighters from 11 surrounding counties quickly made their way to the haunted castle to bring it under control, and by 7:45 p.m, a little over an hour after the fire started, the blaze was finally contained. After firefighters successfully battled the intense 2000-degree heat and flames that shot 100 feet high. Astonishingly, Astonishingly, despite the haunted castle burning, the rest of the park remained open. Around 15,000 guests continued enjoying other rides, until the park finally closed early at about 8 PM, once the fire was subdued. Visitors were also issued free return tickets as compensation. The rescue crews later discovered that 7 out of the 8 teens that got trapped remained together in one spot, while one, in a futile attempt to escape, was found a little further away. They were burned beyond recognition, so severely that when the rescue workers first spotted them, they thought they were mannequins or props from the haunted castle. Now, investigations into what caused the fire began immediately, and on May 19, 1984, a witness who'd been with Adam described to the investigators how the fire started by accident. Luckily for Adam, he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, as he was only trying to find his way in the dark, and the fire was officially ruled accidental. Now, attention soon turned to park management instead, who'd been ignoring repeated warnings from their own safety consultants to improve fire safety, and as a result, on September 14, 1984, a grand jury in Toms River, New Jersey indicted Six Flags Great Adventure, its parent company Six Flags Corporation, and the two executives Larry and David for aggravated manslaughter. The charges stated that they had recklessly caused deaths under circumstances showing extreme indifference to human life. And so in July 1985, after an 8-week trial and 13 hours of deliberation, a jury found Six Flags Corporation and its subsidiary, Great Adventure Inc., not guilty. The managers David and Larry also never went to trial, since this was their first offense. They were only ordered 300 hours of community service, and a period of supervision before the manslaughter charges against them were dismissed in March of 1986, without any admission of guilt. Now, after the criminal case, Six Flags paid millions to the victims' families in late 1985 and early 1987, with 7 families settling for $9.5 million each in 1985, while one family went to trial and was awarded $750,000 in 1987. Then, 1 year later, the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA, added a section for special amusement buildings, like haunted houses, in the standard fire safety rules. Because of this tragedy, all similar buildings were now required to have automatic sprinklers, smoke detection systems, and exits that are clearly lit whenever an alarm sounded. Now, after the fire, Six Flags Great Adventure took major steps to improve safety across the park. They spent $5.2 million installing preventative measures throughout the park, set up an in-house fire brigade for emergencies, and installed backup generators so emergency lights would work even during a power failure. And though the fire of the haunted castle was ruled an accident, the next case involves a vicious attack that happened in front of hundreds of people during a famous Halloween festival.
Terrified, so terrified. Because just when you see that blood, you just don't know.
It was September 24th, 2022, and the historic Kennywood Park in West Mifflin, Pennsylvania, had just opened for the first day of its 2022 Phantom Fall Fest. Now, the Phantom Fall Fest was first introduced in the amusement park the previous year as a seasonal Halloween event with haunted houses, actors scaring people with chainsaws, fake fog on the midway, and extended evening hours to celebrate fall on the weekends. And the event was such a success that they made it an annual thing. So as the Kennywood doors opened that day in 2022, long line of visitors made their way inside to enjoy the spooky night attractions offered by the park. As with any special attraction, Kennywood expected bigger crowds than normal during the Phantom Fall Fest, and to prepare, they had already started improving security in March of 2022. The park then installed the Evolve Express Weapons Detection System, which is a state-of-the-art system used to screen people for concealed weapons at the entrance gates, along with bag searches and video screening to check all guests and staff, in case anyone tried to bring in prohibited items, such as firearms. They also introduced a chaperone policy for the fest. Any guest who was not of age yet had to be accompanied by an adult, aged 21 or older, after 4 PM. This decision was part of a broader effort to reduce disturbances and fights involving minors inside the park. So on September 24th, as guests entered Kennywood, park management seemed like they were ready to kick off the fest. As hundreds of visitors enjoyed the spooky rides and attractions under the fall night sky, staff and guests noticed a lot of unaccompanied teens. Some of these young people would also start displaying aggressive behavior, with several groups of teenagers trying to start fights in different areas. Now, as the nights progressed, things started taking a turn for the worse. By 10:30 PM, there were already several loud disputes between different groups of teenagers, so much so that some park guests even started leaving early. Then at around 10:45 PM, 2 rival groups from Mon Valley communities suddenly started a fight, pushing, shoving, and punching each other near the Music Express ride in the last Kennywood section. Now, during the fight, the members of the group started running through the Music Express ride's exit gate, and this triggered the safety systems, causing lights to turn on, which immediately made the nearby ride operators aware that there was an emergency situation in the park. Now at the same time, park-goer Don Okorski and his wife were just heading for the exit when they saw two boys running into each other before getting into a fist fight near the Music Express ride. Now since they'd already seen actors scaring people around the park, it didn't ring any alarm bells when they saw the boys. So when at exactly 10:49 PM, Don heard some loud noise inside the park, he initially thought they were fireworks. As it turned out though, those were actually gunshots that had hit 3 people. First was 39-year-old Brandon Ward, who was with his wife waiting for their daughter at the Music Express ride. Then there were 2 Daryl Pearl and an unnamed person. Now as Allegheny County Police and West Mifflin Police rushed to the scene after distress calls, the security officers already on site jumped into action, helping victims and guiding crowds towards safe exits to manage the chaos. By 12:30 AM on September 25th, 2022, the police had announced that the active shooter threat was over. The park had been fully evacuated and secured, with a heavy police presence throughout the grounds. The victims were also getting treated for their gunshot wounds at local hospitals. And luckily, none of the victims died as a result of the shooting. Now the employees had to stay inside the park until about 1 AM, while officers swept the area with assault rifles, and once it was safe, the staff was also escorted out. And the park would later release a statement regarding the gun attack, saying,
"We are greatly saddened by the violence that occurred last night. Our thoughts are with those who were injured as a result of the incident, as well as all guests and team members affected by what happened."
Now police quickly began gathering evidence to determine what had caused the shooting, using park security cameras and witness statements. They recovered a handgun near the scene of the crime, and they also quickly determined that there had been 2 shooters, since shell casings from 2 different guns were found on the ground. The recovered guns was also later tracked to Columbus, where it was allegedly stolen from a car in August of 2021. Now while police were still searching for the 2 culprits, Kennywood reopened for Phantom Fall Fest on September 30th with enhanced security measures. They also increased the number of police officers across the park, especially at entrances and busy areas. They also focused on the park's perimeter by adding even more patrols along the fences, improving lighting and installing more cameras to prevent people from sneaking in. On top of that, they updated their chaperone policy, requiring younger visitors to be accompanied by an adult at all times, not just in the evening. Then on October 6, 2022, the police made an arrest related to the gun attack, and the name shocked everyone.
After almost 2 weeks, Allegheny County Police arrest 15-year-old Daryl Pearl for his involvement in the shooting at Kennywood Park that injured 2 people.
Police claimed he was involved in the ongoing feud between Mon Valley groups who've been causing disturbances at the park, and they identified him as Daryl, using the evidence they collected when he went to the local hospital for treatment after the gun attack. There was gunshot residue on his hands, clothes, and his shirt had bullet holes even though there were no injuries on his upper body, suggesting he'd fired a gun from underneath his shirt. But even with Daryl in custody, the search for the second shooter continued. Even though Daryl was 15, authorities charged him as an adult with aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and firearm crimes. However, the charges didn't actually hold for long. On November 9, 2022, after a preliminary hearing, a judge dismissed all charges against Daryl due to insufficient evidence. There was no DNA or fingerprints linking him to the recovered gun. As for the second attacker, police never publicly identified or arrested anyone. Until today, no one has paid for the terror caused by Kennywood that night. Now, while the Halloween festival attack ended without justice, the next popular State Fair ride became the setting of such a shocking tragedy that it forced the government of Ohio to rethink their safety laws.
It just flew off. The whole thing flew off. Her leg hit. When her leg hit, her leg just like flew. Her whole leg. And then it hit the ground.
On July 26, 2017, 18-year-old Tyler Jarrell and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Kezia Lewis, were among the large crowds filing into the Ohio State Fairgrounds in Columbus. Tyler had enlisted in the Marines just 5 days earlier and was due to start his training the following year. It was the opening day of the state fair, and one of their most famous rides was the Fireball, which had a long arm that swung back and forth like a giant pendulum. At the bottom of this arm was a circular section called the claw, where the seats were attached for riders. Now, as the ride picked up speed, it swung higher and higher into the air, reaching up to 40 to 60 feet, while the seating section spun at the same time, making around 13 to 15 revolutions per minute. Now, all afternoon on opening day, guests had been flocking to that specific ride, waiting in long lines to get on and spin through the air. So Tyler and Kezia decided to get in on the fun too. Around 7 PM, they joined other passengers and got onto one of the 4-seat carriages. They were buckled into their seats as the ride started its usual cycle of swinging back and forth. Now, several bystanders were recording videos as the ride swung higher and higher. At exactly 10:45 PM, the Fireball had reached its full speed, with riders high up in the air, and that's when tragedy struck. Without warning, a loud metallic crack echoed through the air as one of the 6 steel arms suddenly snapped. Now screams erupted as an entire 4-seat gondola completely broke off the ride. The gondola was carrying Tyler, Kezia, and other riders as it was violently thrown outward and downward. Now as the gondola broke apart mid-air, Tyler was flung from a seat and thrown nearly 50 feet into the air before crashing onto the concrete below. Other riders in the gondola were thrown out or struck by flying debris from the broken ride. Now the ride operator, Cesar Martinez, immediately hit the emergency stop button, but the damage was done and it was all caught on video. Not long afterwards, the remaining arms of the fireball slowed down and the ride came to a stop. Riders who were still strapped in were guided off the ride. On the ground, people rushed towards the victims, trying to help in the middle of the chaos.
Yeah, they're giving the girl that hit the ground CPR.
She ain't moving at all. Come on, please.
Yeah, there's people, several people came flying out.
Now emergency responders arrived at the scene within minutes, but Tyler was found unresponsive on the ground. He had severe injuries to his head, torso, and lower body, and sadly he was pronounced dead at the scene just 6 minutes later. Now 7 other riders, including Kezia, 36-year-old Tamika Dunlap, 42-year-old Russell Franks, 22-year-old Jacob Andrews, 18-year-old Jennifer Lambert, and 19-year-old Abdi Hakim Hussein, and an unnamed minor, were seriously injured. Some had broken bones and head injuries, while others suffered from internal injuries. They were rushed by ambulance to nearby hospitals, where they all received emergency treatment. Now right after the incident on July 26, all rides at the Ohio State Fair were shut down for emergency safety checks, but the fair did reopen the next day on July 27. Once the officials confirmed that other rides were safe, but the fireball was permanently shut down. Now on the day of the reopening, Ohio governor at the time, John Kasich, called the incident a nightmare, but encouraged people to still visit the fair, saying,
"We will pull together and come through this, and we will have an even stronger fair as a result."
Now on the same day, the ride's Dutch manufacturer KMG International also released a statement, saying,
"Our deepest sympathies go out to all who were involved or affected by this tragic accident."
And now Amusements of America, which actually owned the fireball attraction, said in another statement,
"Our family-owned company is committed to working with state and local experts to determine the cause of this tragic accident."
But they also shared one shocking detail. Several days before the fair opened, the fireball arrived in Columbus and was put together by Amusements of America crews. Now after the initial setup, inspectors from the Ohio Department of Agriculture checked the ride multiple times on July 24th and 25th, and the ride passed every inspection with no problems recorded. Now earlier on the morning of July 26th, on the opening day of the fair, final safety checks were made and the ride was cleared for public operation that evening. So to find out why the ride actually failed after passing all those inspections, the Ohio State Highway Patrol led a detailed criminal investigation, and the officers interviewed the ride operators, state inspectors, witnesses, and collected broken ride parts to figure out exactly what caused the massive failure. Now while all of this was going on July 30th, a coroner's report confirmed that Tyler had indeed died from blunt force trauma. On August 6, 2017, just 11 days after the accident, KMG released their official findings, confirming that the tragic accident was actually caused by internal corrosion. In a memo on their Facebook page, they said,
"Excessive corrosion inside the gondola support beam had dangerously thinned the metal over the years. This eventually led to the catastrophic failure of the ride during operation."
They also told owners of similar rides around the world to pause them for extra safety checks. By this time though, the families and victims had already begun legal actions. But then came the biggest blow for those affected. On August 31st, 2017, Franklin County prosecutors announced that there would be no criminal charges against the ride operators or state inspectors, claiming that there wasn't enough evidence of negligence. But then in September, a photo from the fair that resurfaced online would raise serious questions about this decision. The photo was taken by fairgoer Brian Burry, which he gave to State Highway Patrol investigators, and it showed a crack along the arm of the fireball. Surprisingly, it was the exact spot where the ride later broke apart on that horrific day. But despite this photo, no further charges were filed. Instead, in March 2018, Tyler's family reached a partial settlement of $1.27 million with Amusements of America and 2 private inspection companies. However, the families of Tyler and 3 other seriously injured riders, including Kezia, were not ready to give up just yet. In June 2019, they filed a lawsuit against KMG. They claimed that the company had known about the corrosion problem since 2012, but didn't actually warn the ride operators or fix it. This was documented in a letter they discovered that had been sent by the company. Now this trial would go on until 2023, when the court found KMG guilty of negligence for not warning ride owners about the lack of weep holes in the beams, which caused the corrosion that led to the accident. Now weep holes are small drainage openings in hollow metal beams that allow trapped water to escape, preventing internal rust. Now nearly 7 years after Tyler's death, on July 5th, 2024, a New Jersey court ruled in favor of the victims, and Tyler's estate and 3 other survivors were awarded $78 million, while Kezia received $20 million. Now even though Tyler's life was tragically cut short, his death led to a real change. His mother, Amber Duffield, made it her mission to improve ride safety, so no other mother has to endure what she did. And a few years later, her hard work paid off, as Ohio Governor Mike DeWine signed Tyler's law in her son's honor, which came into full effect in 2021. This law requires ride owners to look inside metal parts for rust or cracks, keep detailed records for the ride even if it's sold, and have the biggest rides inspected by 2 people instead of just 1 to catch any mistakes. In this next case, however, nothing actually broke in the ride. Instead, a critical safety procedure was ignored, leading to a tragedy that no one saw coming. Tyree Sampson was a young man from Missouri who was known to his family and his friends as a gentle giant. Even though he was still very young, he was already over 6 feet tall and weighed around 383 pounds. As a straight-A student and a standout football player, Tyree had a promising future. He was already prepared to attend East St. Louis Senior High School in Illinois the following year to play for the East St. Louis Flyers. In March 2022, Tyree then decided to go to Florida for spring break. He usually spent his time off with his father, Yarnell Sampson, but that year Tyree decided to visit a friend's family along with his football teammates. On March 24th, during this trip, Tyree and his friends decided to go to Icon Park, like hundreds of others that day. Only 3 months earlier, in December 2021, the park had introduced the Orlando Freefall, the world's tallest freestanding drop tower at 430 feet. Now the ride lifted buckled-in passengers high into the air, tilted them forward, and then dropped them nearly 400 feet at speeds over 75 miles per hour. And Tyree wanted to experience that thrill too. That night, he stood in line for the freefall ride, excited and ready for the drop. But as Tyree and others were being buckled into their seats, they were all unaware of some very disturbing details. While the ride passed its first safety inspection on December 20th, 2021, by mid-January of the next year, a maintenance worker named Austin Campbell Alexander started noticing some problems. Some seats weren't working properly, and sensors were being adjusted so larger riders could still get on, even though there was a 287-pound weight limit. This made the safety harness gap much wider than it should have been. In early March of 2022, Austin and another worker reported more serious concerns. A metal part that locked riders in place was overheating, and there were cracks in parts of the ride. These issues were all reported to supervisors, but no actions were ever taken, and the ride continued to operate as usual. On that day of his visit, Tyree had already been turned away from 2 rides for being overweight, but operators on Freefall didn't stop him. As he was getting onto the ride, there were no scales or visible signs mentioning the weight limit, which he was nearly 100 pounds over. Now around 11 PM, Tyree got into seat 1 on the Freefall ride, and since he exceeded the weight limit, the harness couldn't be pulled down properly. Now videos taken by bystanders showed that his harness was much further out than the other riders. To make it work, operators adjusted the sensors so the safety lights turned green, even though the gap was still dangerously wide. The attendants then checked the harness and decided all riders, including Tyree, were good to go as the gondola began to rise up. Now at the top, the ride tilted forward before dropping at a very high speed. Now people below watched, recording the moment on their phones. And as the ride braked during the drop at approximately 11 PM, Tyree slipped through the gap in the harness. Videos show him falling from the seat and striking the ground hard, while the other riders remained secured. Now emergency crews arrived within minutes, and at the time he was still breathing but unresponsive, so he was rushed to a nearby hospital. Unfortunately, in the early hours of March 25th, 2022, Tyree was pronounced dead due to blunt force trauma. After the incident, Orange County Sheriff's deputies and Florida Department of Agriculture inspectors immediately shut down the ride and began a joint investigation. Now as the investigation gained attention, cell phone videos of Tyree's fall spread all over the internet. Even Yarnell saw the video of his son's final moments online, saying in an interview with CNN shortly after the fatal fall,
"I saw the video of my son falling down and I couldn't believe it. My life stopped. I want to know what really happened, where a young man with a bright future was taken away from us."
Now less than a month after Tyree's death, on April 18, 2022, state officials released a preliminary report on the incident, detailing what really happened that fateful day. It turns out that there was no mechanical or electrical failure on the ride itself. Instead, the problem was with the seat. The sensor had been manually adjusted, creating a gap that was much wider than it should have been, likely to allow people over the weight limit to ride the freefall. But this of course went against the manufacturer's rules. While usually the seat harness had a gap of about 3 inches, Tyree's seat had a gap of 6 to 7 inches. And investigators believe that because of the speed and his weight, the gap may have been opened to almost 10 inches, causing him to slip out to his death. Now after these findings, Tyree's mother, Nakia Dodd, called for the ride to be removed.
I want the ride going, because it shouldn't have taken a child or anyone to lose their life to put laws in place. This could have been prevented.
And soon after, in late April of 2022, Tyrese's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against three main parties: the ride operator, the Icon Park, and the manufacturer. Now, almost a year after their son's life was cut short, in February of 2023, the state fined the ride operator, Orlando Eagle Drop Slingshot LLC, $250,000 and banned them from ever operating that drop tower in Florida again. This was one of the largest administrative fines ever by Florida's amusement ride regulators. Now, a month later, in March of 2023, Tyrese's family reached private settlements with the operator and Icon Park. Now, the exact amounts weren't shared, but the ride was permanently taken down.
It's breathtaking. It's not in a good way. This is my son took his last breath on this ride, so it's heartbreaking. It's a feeling that I hope no parent will ever have to go through after this ride comes down.
But their legal battles were far from over. The ride manufacturer, Funtime Handels GmbH, did not settle with the parents. In fact, the company didn't even show up in court. And because of this, a jury trial was held in December of 2024 and found the company responsible for problems in the ride's design and safety. And so they awarded Tyrese's parents $310 million, with each parent getting $155 million. This was one of the largest wrongful death verdicts in Florida history. However, since the company is based in Austria and didn't take part in the case, whether or when the family will get the money remains uncertain. The next case was also caught on video, but this time it was recorded from the point of view of the rider on the malfunctioning ride. On February 13, 2021, large crowds made their way to Shaoyang County Amusement Park in Hunan Province, China. It was the second day of the Lunar New Year celebrations, and the park had opened just a day ago, and families had come out in big numbers for the holidays. One of the most popular attractions at the park was the Flying Chairs swing ride. It had been inspected before opening, and no issues were reported. The ride had operated all day on its first day without any problems. On that second day, just like the day before, riders were being buckled in groups of two, while others stood nearby, watching the chairs spin high in the air. Some people even had their phones out, trying to capture the moment as the ride swung around. Now, at that point, everything felt completely normal. At around 3:40 p.m, a new group of riders got on, and the ride began as usual. Now, one of the riders had a camera in their hand and started filming their time. Now, the video captured the park from a high point on the swing, and for a few moments it was just another fun ride being captured on camera. But suddenly an alarm started going off on the ride, and the rider's video showed that almost instantly the ride began speeding up far beyond normal. The chair spun faster and faster, swinging wildly as riders realized something was terribly wrong. And screams filled the air as helpless riders kept spinning at an increasing speed. Now, within seconds, the situation turned into chaos. The central structure of the ride failed, and the entire top section started wobbling. The moving chairs lost support in the air and were thrown to the ground. Some broke off completely and crashed into the ground and nearby fences. Terrifying people started standing around the ride. Now, a witness identified only by surname, Dang, was one of the many people who were in line for the ride nearby. He narrowly escaped being hit by the swinging chairs as he ran away from the horrible scene unfolding in front of him. There was chaos everywhere as riders hit the ground hard and people standing nearby tried to run to safety. Now, as the swinging chairs fell to the ground, riders remained stuck in their seat as others tried to help them get out. Emergency calls were made as park staff ran toward the destroyed ride, where broken chairs were scattered and injured people lay on the ground. Now, 16 people were injured, out of which 3 were seriously hurt. This included riders who fell from the chairs and bystanders who were hit by flying debris. Now, Chinese authorities didn't publicly release the names of those injured, but within minutes, all injured people were taken to nearby hospitals. Thankfully, no one lost their life, and by evening, authorities had shut down the entire park for a full investigation. Now, the very next day, on February 14, 2021, officials from the Hunan province began examining the destroyed ride, and early findings pointed to a mechanical issue with the ride's electronic control system, with no signs of human error. And even so, the park stayed closed for the Lunar New Year season. And even though no one lost their lives, the incident deepened public concern about amusement park safety in China, a fear that was far from isolated. That same year, at least 3 similar accidents were reported during the Lunar New Year holidays alone.